to one more session of the Logic and Religion webinar, which is organized by the Logic and Religion Association, LARA. I would ask everyone to mute your mics. All right. Thank you so much. So the Logic and Religion webinar is designed to be an open platform for scholars interested in the relationship between logic and religion, reason and faith, rational inquiry, and divine revelation. Its sessions take place once a month, always on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Central European Time. So our speaker today is Professor Attoe from South Africa. He will speak about a theme we have already addressed in our last webinar, which is the problem of evil. The title of his talk is The Anatomy of God and the Problem of Evil, Lessons from an African Perspective. And the session will be chaired by my colleague, Assis Mariano. So Assis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Ricardo. I believe everyone is hearing me well, right? So today we'll have Professor Attoe. He's from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He is the co-recipient of the Global Philosophy of Religion Project grant funded by the John Templeton Foundation in collaboration with the University of Birmingham in England. He is hosted by the Center of the Leadership Ethics in Africa. He was formerly a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Leadership Ethics in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, and earned his PhD in African philosophy at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He has co-authored several books, some which include Groundwork for New Kind of African Metaphysics, the Idea of Predeterministic Historicity, New Conversations on the Problems of Identity, Consciousness, and Mind, as well as a systematic account of African conceptions of the meaning of life. So he's going to speak, as Ricardo said, he's going to speak about the problem of evil from an African perspective. So Professor Attoe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Francisco, for your kind introduction. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words to my African ancestors. To our wise ancestors, men and women of wisdom, despite the violence, both epistemic and gruesome, against you, your ideas still inspire us, like the eternal linkage symbolized by our umbilical cords and our predetermined history. No violence can ever sever your views from our views. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the problem of evil, and I'll be approaching it specifically from an African perspective. So what I'm going to be doing in the talk is provide an overview of what the problem of evil is, and then I'll talk about some responses from the African view. And after doing that, I will also present my own views about the idea of God, the nature of God, and how that relates to the problem of evil. But before I begin, there are a few preliminary things that we should take note of as we proceed in this talk. First of all, my main concern is with African conceptions of God, and not with conceptions of God from other traditions like the Abrahamic traditions or the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Hindu tradition, and so on and so forth. All right, so I was muted a bit there. All right, so the second thing, or let me start again. There are a few preliminaries that I want us to take note of as far as this talk is concerned. First is I'll be concerned with African conceptions of God and not with conceptions of God from other traditions per se, like the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Hindu tradition or any other tradition whatsoever. My concern is with the African conceptions of God. Second thing that we should take note is that I am talking about the supreme being when I'm talking about the idea of God. I do not mean lower deities. So, for instance, in many African traditions, there is this idea that there is a supreme being at the top of the hierarchy of beings, and he has all these underlings or minor gods or lower deities, that support the supreme being, carrying out the wishes of this supreme being. Okay, I am not talking about those lower deities. I'm talking about the supreme being. Another thing that I want us to note as we proceed in this talk is that I'll be using the term anonymous traditional African philosophers or philosophies. It's a term that I borrow from the African philosopher Innocent Asuzu, and I use it to denote ancient traditional African philosophers whose ideas can be found in the oral literature or the value system of Africans in their communal worldview and all that, but whose names are unknown. We know that these ideas exist and these ideas must have proceeded from someone, but we do not have their names because within pre-colonial African philosophy, the penchant towards looking for or taking ownership of certain ideas was really absent. So we do not have names for some of the ideas that are, predominant in African worldviews. All right. Now, on to the problem of evil itself. What are we talking about when we talk about the problem of evil? The problem of evil is a simple one. It tries to present the incompatibility of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, all-good God, God with all these omni-properties that we like to give to God, and the existence of evil. And the idea itself, the problem itself, is said to have arisen from the works of a certain Greek philosopher called Epicurus, when he tried to, think about why evil exists, even though the gods were thought of as, all good, all powerful, and so on and so forth. So for him, in his mind, he's thinking, if God is willing to prevent evil, but is not able to prevent evil, then that God is not omnipotent. That God is an impotent God, right? If this God is able but not willing to prevent evil, then that God is not a good God. It's a malevolent God. And if we say that God is both willing and able to prevent evil, then where does evil come from? How was Trump the president of America, for instance? All right, I was just joking. All right, but he was drawing on a very powerful problem, which sought to show the incompatibility, even the logical incompatibility even, of the idea of an omniperfect God or omni-good God or an omnipowerful God or an all-knowing God and the presence of evil, since the idea that God has all these omni-properties would compel that God, logically speaking, to prevent evil and not create evil also. So in a nutshell, that is what the problem of evil is all about. And from our understanding of this notion of evil, we begin to see how important idea of the nature of God is crucial to this problem of evil. So for instance, if God is the sort of God that possesses these omni-properties as part of its nature, as you would find in many traditions like the Judeo-Christian tradition, then the paradox applies, the problem of evil applies. If we say that God does not possess all these omni-properties, then there is no problem of evil anymore. If there is no God, if we are atheists and say, well, there is no God, then there is no problem of evil either. So we see how the nature of God plays a very important role in our understanding of the problem of evil. So for us to move further, we need to understand what God means, or the nature of God for most Africans, so pre-colonial traditional Africans. in their worldview? How do they understand God? What attributes do they ascribe to God? This would help us in trying to understand this problem of evil from an African perspective. And within the African view, there are two main opposing sort of schools of thought. There are two main schools of thought with regards to the nature of God. There is the dominant view, which conceives of God in these as an all-powerful being and so on and so forth, as possessing omni-properties. And there's also the view that God has certain limited capabilities, and this is what we call the limited God thesis. So within that context, God is not thought of as all-powerful. God is thought of as powerful, but not all-powerful, as very knowledgeable, but not all-knowing, and so on and so forth. So let's begin to talk about these two opposing schools of thought and their ideas about God, or their ideas about the nature of God. So for the dominant view that conceives of God as having all these omni-properties, God is thought of as omnipotent. And linguistic analysis of some African communities or societies, you begin to find the ways in which God is described by these communities. So certain African philosopher and theologian, whose name is John Beattie, did this linguistic analysis, and according to him, there are all these names that are being ascribed to God. So God is thought of as all-powerful, the almighty, the irresistible one, and so on and so forth, right? God is, and for another African philosopher whose name is Nkulu Nsenga, he says that God is capable of creating things and uncreating things. For me, that captures the true sense in which all-powerful is encapsulated, because any being that has the power to create things in the world and also uncreate things in the world, that is, take them out of existence, then that being is an all-powerful being. And Nkulu Nsenga believes that within the context of traditional Africa, God is capable of creating and uncreating things. So God is omnipotent, according to the view. God is also considered holy and benevolent and all good. So Nkulu Nsenga again says that in some traditional African societies, like the Baluba and the Bakongo traditions, God is considered as intrinsically good and the source of any good in human life. Now, for a being that is intrinsically good and the source of any good that exists in the world, that being must be all good, an all good God, an omnibenevolent God. Another way to look at it is to refer to the harmony that exists in the world and the fact that only a good God would create a habitable world. And this is the view of people like John Beattie and again Nkulu Nsenga. So God is thought of as omnibenevolent within this particular school of thought. Then there's also the idea that God is all-knowing. So Beattie writes that God's omniscience is absolute, unlimited, and an intrinsic part of the eternal nature of God. And he gives several examples that, in my mind, does not really show this absolute characteristic of God, but sort of shows that God is a wise God. So he says that according to the Zulu and the Bayawanda, God is known as the wise one. According to the Akan, he's known as the one who sees and knows all, and so on and so on and so forth. He gives many ideas as to why he thinks that God's omniscience is absolute, which is a very strong word. All right. So this is the first dominant school of thought that believes that God has all these absolute properties, relevant properties of omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and also omniscience, right? And then there is also the limited God view. So for most Yoruba philosophers, for example, philosophers like John Bewaji and Babajide Dasalu, God does possess certain flaws. And we can intuit that this is true from the oral literature of that particular society. So for instance, in the Ifa corpus, which is the oral philosophical literature of the traditional Yoruba philosophers, there is the idea that God is not omniscient because God consults with other deities, other lower deities, in matters that he does not have knowledge of, right? So God cannot be all-knowing if he has to consult with certain other deities on certain other matters, right? God is not all good, for instance. There are examples in the Ifa corpus where God is shown as creating evil. So an all-good God, an omnibenevolent God, cannot be a God that creates evil. So there are certain limits to God's omnibenevolence and omnipotence and omniscience. So God might be the most powerful being in the world, might be the most knowledgeable being in the world, might be the most benevolent being in the world. But it does not follow that God is absolutely good or absolutely powerful or absolutely knowledgeable, at least from the Yoruba perspective. And there are also other ideas like the consolationist God. Consolationism is a philosophy by the African philosopher Attoe, who is also a member of the conversational school, who proposes that God is a being of power and glory, even though he does not describe the nature of God in very, very explicit and elaborate terms. His idea that God is a being of power and glory seems to suggest that even though God has a lot of power, is a very powerful being, the most powerful being in the world, God is not all powerful. Nevertheless, he still believes that God should, by virtue of his power and glory, try to also eliminate evil in the world. But again, the problem with his view is that if God is not all powerful or all good and is just a being of power and glory, then there must be instances that exist in which God's power is unable to, eradicate or take away evil from the world. All right. He doesn't show that God has absolute power. So there's always that loophole. All right. There is also the harmony God thesis by the African philosophers, Jonathan Chimakonam and Amara Chimakonam. And their view is an interesting one, using what they call ezumezu logic, which is a three-valued logic in African philosophy. They seem to think that the presence of evil is necessary for the presence of good, that they have this complementary relationship between them. All right. So if they have this complementary relationship between them, then the only thing that concerns God in this instance is the idea that perhaps God needs to keep the balance between good and evil in the world and sustain harmony in the world. This does not mean that evil would, totally disappear from the world. And it actually explains why there is evil in the world, because evil is necessary for good in the same way that good is necessary for evil. And so there must be this balance that is sustained by God. That is their view of the harmony God thesis. So all these ideas coalesce to form the limited God thesis. And for this school of thought, the problem of evil does not really arise, because logically speaking, by limiting the power of God, by thinking of God not in absolute terms, they allow for the possibility of evil. So when you ask why is there evil in the world, well, one answer is because God is limited, God is flawed, God is merely a being of power and glory. God needs evil to sustain harmony in the world, and so on and so forth. All these replies can be given. Now, what does this mean for the problem of evil? I've already stated what the limited God thesis implies for the problem of evil. But for the first dominant school that believes that God possesses these properties, the problem of evil still arises. And the question is, how would that particular school of thought respond to this problem of evil? Well, the first way is to blame the human being, right? To say that evil is a feature of human activity. God gave human beings free will. God could not have known what human beings would do, and human beings commit evil in the world. If human beings commit evil in the world, then eradicating human beings from the world would mean eradicating evil. But God cannot eradicate evil from the world. Why? Because doing so would, take a chunk out of God's omnibenevolence. God will not be an omnibenevolent being if it takes out human beings from the world. Now, there are a lot of problems with these ideas. First, you have to explain why God created human beings in the first place. If you say that God did not know what human beings would do, then that calls into question the idea that God is all-knowing. And of course, it does not explain natural evils, right? So hurricanes, floodings that kill thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. How is that explained within this, with regards to this particular response? Another response that they might give with regards to the problem of evil is that perhaps our notion of evil is not the same as God's notion of evil. Perhaps what we think is evil is actually not evil in the grand scheme of things, or at least in God's eye, right? But there's also a problem with this view, because pain, whether or not God thinks there is evil in the world or not, the pain that human beings feel on a daily basis, whether God thinks it's good or not, is still painful to the human being. And pain is not, presumably not a good thing, right? And if pain is not a good thing and human beings experience pain, then there must be something evil in the world, which is the pain that human beings experience. And this has nothing to do with whether God thinks that there is evil in the world or not. All right, logically speaking. And so these are some of the responses that one might get from the first school of thought that thinks that God possesses these omni properties. Now, for me, the responses or the implications of the problem of evil on regards to the limited God thesis and the omni-God thesis, they are all problematic in a way, and I'll say why they are problematic. All these, responses to the idea of the nature of God and the problem of evil implicitly considers God to be a conscious and personalized entity. That is an entity that has personhood, an entity that is conscious, an entity that is intentional, that is capable of doing certain things. And we must take a pause to reflect and try to decipher where all these ideas that we have actually come from. Because for me, there is nothing in the world that suggests that God has any or possesses any of these superlative attributes we like to ascribe to God. If we can barely, prove that God exists, right? Speculating correctly about the nature of God or the more sophisticated features that we think that God possesses is a long shot, and I think is mainly what I call mythological thinking. It cannot assume the guise of plausibility because we have no access to the nature of God. And so whatever attributes we are ascribing to the nature of God, insofar as they do not have any logical backing of plausibility, or we have not found they are imperceptible to us, then we have no business ascribing these properties to God. How do we know that God is omnibenevolent? How do we know that God, is capable of creating evil or not? How do we know that God knows all things when we do not even know if God exists or not? Where do these ideas come from? I think they come from our imaginations. They are just figments of our imaginations. And this is where both the limited God thesis and the omni-God thesis fall away, because they take assumptions seriously that they should not have taken seriously in the first place. All right. And this is where my own view of the whole matter comes in. And to understand what I think with regards to the problem of evil, let us try to think about let me explain what I considered to be the true nature of God. And I come about these ideas through a process of logical thinking, through a process of creative struggle. And so some of these ideas are actually backed by logical plausibility, unlike in the omni-God thesis and the limited God thesis. So the first thing that I would like to ascribe to God is that God is the first cause, right? The cosmological arguments abound that prove that this is the case. From the African point of view, if you look at existing things in the world and also agree to their contingency, then you must agree that there is a first cause, something from which all these contingent things get their legitimacy from. Because otherwise, you would have to imagine that things in the world spontaneously generated out of nothing. And the problem with that view is that within the context of African philosophy or African metaphysics, to be precise, the idea of nothingness is a non-issue. There is nothing like nothingness within the context of African philosophy, mainly because it is impossible to conceive of absolute nothingness. It's possible to imagine, as far as I'm concerned, what absolute nothingness is like. So for most African philosophers and African metaphysicians, the idea of absolute nothingness does not exist, right? So there must be something, and that thing must be a first cause. Of course, one might say, well, what if there is an infinite regress? Why shouldn't we take that idea seriously? And this is a criticism that Jonathan Chimakonam and Amara Chimakonam have provided against my own metaphysics as to the reason why I chose the idea of the first cause and not the idea of an infinite regress. Well, the reason why I did that is simple. If we take an infinite regress to be true, then, and we also assume that there are things in the world that are contingent, right? Then if there is an infinite regress, then the token of existence would not be supplied to things that exist, but things do exist. So we must assume there must be a first cause that necessarily exists, which grants other contingent things in the world their own existence, their own token of existence. So for instance, a good example as to what I mean is if you imagine that you needed to borrow someone, or someone needed some money from you and you wanted to borrow money from that person. But then that person also needed to borrow from someone else and so on and so forth. And it goes on infinitely. If that goes on infinitely, then nobody gets the money. And the same thing applies to when we talk about existence. If things are contingent, that is, their existence depends on something else, and this goes on infinitely, then nothing really exists because the token of existence is not passed through, right? So there must be a first cause that necessarily exists. And I think that first cause to be God. The second thing that I will ascribe to God is materiality. So in much of African philosophy, and I mean, many other traditions, there's this idea that God is a spiritual being as opposed to a material one. But what people who say this fail to do is define what they mean by spirituality and what they mean by materiality, all right? For me, I take materiality to mean the ability of a thing to interact with other things in the world and to impress itself on the conscious mind. That's what I take materiality to mean. And I take spirituality to mean, or in the sense of an unextended thing in the world, which cannot interact with other material things in the world. Now, if spiritual entities exist, if we grant that they exist, it means that it cannot affect material realities or existence as we know it, the universe as we know it. So it cannot be the case that God is a spiritual thing because things in the world exist because of God. And it is in that way that God impresses himself on things in the world. And that is the nature of the relationship we have, or the interaction we have between ourselves and God. All right, at least at the basic minimum. If that is true, and if we take my idea of what materiality means seriously, then we must consider God is a material being. All right. Another two features that are very crucial features that I'll add to our understanding of the nature of God is that God is not a conscious entity, and God does not create in the intentional sense of the word. So what that means is that we must retell the creation story. So it is not that God magically produces things, or at least in the Akan tradition, God, molds some raw materials into the universe and all these other things we have in the world and so on and so forth. That is not the story. We must go and think of it in a different way. The first thing we must understand is that within the context of African thought or African metaphysics, the idea of being alone, that is an entity in isolation, is an unattractive thing to think about. All right. So for me, I even take it further and say it is impossible to be a being alone. To be a being alone, you must be in a relationship with nothingness. And for me, if nothingness is impossible, then we must concede that there exists conditions for relationality within the first cause itself by its mere existence. And so God cannot be a being that is a being alone. And if that is true, and if we also agree that it is this interaction or relationality between things in the world that produces newer things in the world or newer states of affairs, then there is nothing that suggests to me that creation itself has to be an intentional thing. Okay? So the emergence of new things in the world has always been as a result of the relationship between other things in the world. It does not require any sort of divine intervention. By merely existing, things are in relationship with each other. And by being in a relationship with each other, newer states of affairs are created. And if you remember that the first cause possesses necessarily within it the conditions for relationality, then we can't see how other things in the world began to emerge as a result of the relationality that existed within the context of the first cause. So if God is material, if creation does not need to be intentional in the way that we like to think it is, then there is no reason to believe that God is a conscious entity or God is a creator in the intentional sense of the word. Furthermore, we have no evidence to back up any claim to show that God is a conscious entity. We have no evidence. Instead, we have evidence to show that creation itself did not require any conscious effort or any intentional effort. So for me, God is not a conscious entity and God is not a creator of things in the world. And so we come to my response to the problem of evil. If God is not omnibenevolent, holy, or powerful, and all that, if God is not a person, if God is not a personalized entity, right? If God is a material entity that is unconscious and unintentional in the creating process, then the problem of evil fails to exist within my view. Okay, and furthermore, when we even talk about evil, when we examine the concept of evil or the idea of evil, we begin to see something different from what we'd like to think. We like to think that evil is some sort of entity that exists externally or objectively in the world. But there's no reason to believe so. Normally, what we call evil are just things that are not to our benefit at a particular point in time. So a hurricane happening in, say, Jupiter, for instance, is neither good or evil. But a hurricane that kills 10 people or kills our family members is suddenly evil. It is not that the hurricane itself is intrinsically evil. It is that we've projected this idea of evil to this neutral thing by virtue of its impact in our lives, right? So when things work to our benefit, when things in the world enable certain beneficial outcomes for us, we like to think of those things as good. And the opposite, when it doesn't benefit us, we like to think of it as evil. So it then seems to me that the idea of evil is not an objective thing in the world, but is rather, in my opinion, a category of the mind. It's a category we like to impose on things that are beneficial, that are not beneficial to us. So if evil is not a real thing, if it is just a category of the mind, then evil does not really exist per se. And so if God is not the sort of being that is a personalized entity that is capable of stopping evil or is incapable of creating evil, and if evil itself is something that does not exist objectively and is basically a category of the mind, then there is no problem of evil within the context of my view. And African philosopher John Bewaji seems to agree when he says that nothing is intrinsically evil. We call something evil because it does not favor us or because it causes us distress. We may not know or understand the reason for the event or action, but once it does not favor us or once it causes us any distress, we like to think of it as evil. All right. So this is just my idea of the nature of God and the problem of evil, the idea of evil, the nature of evil, and the implications of all these ideas to the problem of evil. And I'll end my talk with this sort of test statement as to regarding my own views about God and the problem of evil. In a predeterministic world that is indifferent to our plight, evil is fully captured, but only as the category of the mind or our brains in its encounter with things that do not benefit our survival. While evil is lodged in our brains, God cannot do anything about it, for God is just a simple being, a singular reality whose only power lies in its being a first cause and by extension, the determiner of the trajectory of the world. This simple being cannot alter this predetermined world in a bid to exercise the concept of evil from our minds, mainly because it is a being without consciousness. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Attoe. Now we have our Q&A as usual. So you can ask your question either via chat or by speaking out loud. We have first Professor Ricardo, first question. In the meantime, you can raise your hand or ask the question via chat. Okay, so first Professor Ricardo and then Hope after him. Go ahead, Ricardo, please.
Thank you, Assis. Thank you very much, Professor Arbia. Very, very nice, very interesting talk. Well, I have a couple of questions, but I will ask two of them. The first one is much more a comment than a question, and they're related to the second part of your talk, where you presented your own views about the problem of evil. So the first one is more like a comment. It's like you mentioned the problem about framing the concept of evil, and it is a problem. But as far as I can see it, most of the contemporary debate in analytic philosophy of religion, many people, instead of speaking of evil, they speak of suffering. It's a much more objective notion. In this way, they sort of escape many objections that people have raised about the concept of evil itself. So it's much more a comment, because when you speak about suffering, I mean, people suffer, we see them suffering, we feel suffering, so it's kind of objective. But the second point is really a question. When you speak, you in the beginning, you correctly spoke about the need of defining well the concept of God at stake, because depending on the concept of God or conception of God, we are going to have a different problem of evil or no problem of evil at all, and so on and so forth. And people they have been working with that. So your defense that God is not a conscious entity called my attention, because I just wonder, of course, we have hundreds of concepts or conceptions of God, and it's very hard to give like a single definition of Godhood, or why all these different concepts and sometimes contradictory concepts, why they are still concepts of God. But it seems to me, and I would like to hear from you, that defending the existence of a being, even if it is a so-called first cause, that is not conscious, is that still, can we still call it God? It is still a concept of God, because it seems to me that consciousness or awareness, of course, there are different concepts of consciousness, it's like an essential feature of Godhood. And we have religions that don't accept, like Advaita Vedanta or even Buddhism, they don't accept that the supreme entity is conscious or is personal in this sense. So usually in the textbooks we call them atheistic, because there's no God in their ontology. Well, that's it. I'd like to hear from you.
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think some other persons have asked me that question. The assumption here is that consciousness is necessary in any definition of God. I mean, for some traditions, that might be true, but for me personally, I don't think that it is necessary for a definition of God, at least not my understanding of God. I think that, anyway, in my book, Groundwork for New Kind of African Metaphysics, I use it, when I'm talking about God, I use the term it, and I also say the thing we call God. So for me, Godhood, or the power of God, or the nature of God, is captured merely in its being the first cause and the originator of other things in the world, or the way the world is as we know it today. In that sense, I do not think consciousness is necessary at least in my understanding of God. I do not think that it is. I only think of God in terms of being a first cause, whatever that might be, right? So yeah, if you might say that, well, it is not God, it's just any other thing in the world, but I think it needs the first cause needs a special place in our diction, by virtue of it being the first cause, being eternal, because it has to necessarily exist. And I think that is good enough for at least for my definition of what God is. All right.
Thank you very much. Next is Hope. Please, Hope, go ahead, ask your question.
Hello.
Hi.
First thing I just want to say is I assigned your paper on the meaning of life to my meaning of life class, and they loved it. So
wow, nice.
they absolutely loved it. I did my best, but with it. But I have a question about your money example as the response
to
the regress alternative. So here's what I was thinking. You're like, if they keep passing the money, no one ever gets the money. And that seems correct if you think of like potential infinity as like an endless process. But if you think of actual infinity as like maybe process such like that completed, it's not clear to me that that's a problem on the actual infinity sort of interpretation. And if that makes sense, that led me to wonder, what are the concepts of the infinite in like African philosophy that would be relevant? To think about something like that.
So what I want you to do is to help me differentiate between actual and potential infinity. Let's start from there.
This is not my area. I'm thinking Aristotle here. But I was thinking the potential is definitely like this endless process. And so I can see how, if you're like, if we got this process of change ongoing endlessly, no one ever gets what they're trying to get, because it's always passing. But then there's this idea of God as like an actual infinite, so it's not a process type thing. So I guess I'm not good at explaining actual infinite, but I do think that I could, when I hear your example, it makes sense to me. The critique makes sense if it's an infinite process, but if there's some other concept of infinite, then I don't know why, like an actual infinite. I don't know why it would be an issue for them to have existence in that kind of way. So,
I mean, first of all, I think what is most important is our definition of what contingency means. If we mean by contingency that a certain thing in the world is dependent on another thing or certain forms of relationships or a certain state of affairs for its own existence, such that if those things or those states of affairs did not exist, that thing would not exist, then we have to take the critique seriously. Because like in the money example, it's not even as if the money is being passed around. It is that people keep asking for the money. So there is an infinite asking of the money, and then nobody ever gets the money to pass it on. So if it is a case that things are contingent in the way that I have just defined it, such that their existence depended on certain other things in the world, and we imagine that this causal link or this causal chain goes on infinitely, whether potentially or actually, then you must also agree that nothing really ever exists, because there will always be a sort of dependency on something else for existence. But fortunately, things do exist, at least as far as we know. I think I exist. I think you exist. Hopefully, this is not like the Matrix or whatever. And if things exist, then logically speaking, we must agree that there is something which has to be necessary that grants existence to other contingent things, right? So I don't think even in actual terms, the infinite regress thing works. And I think it is simpler, and if you use Occam's razor, it's easy. I mean, it's simpler to think that there is something necessary, something that is all-pervading, at least regressively eternal, that grants other things in the world their own legitimacy and their own existence. For the question about whether there is an idea of infinite regress in African metaphysics, I do not think there is. I've not encountered such. The closest I've encountered is Chimakonam's critique of my work, suggesting that perhaps we jump too quickly to this idea of the first cause, and perhaps we need to think about the infinite regress thing. And I have to go think about it a bit more. And yeah, for me, it still doesn't work. And I don't think it works in the African worldview. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hope.
Before I give the word to Maduka, we have another question in the chat. So Mauricio Kritz is asking, are you equating consciousness to intentionality on your plan? Or, I mean, consciousness or plan in your framework? And that seems to be a question regarding, I mean, if you have consciousness, then there's no intentionality. I mean, do you need intentionality or not in your plan?
So I do not equate per se. I mean, you can't equate. I don't want to think about equating consciousness with intentionality at this point. That's there's a lot to untangle there. But I do think there needs to be consciousness for intentionality to exist. You need to have a conscious being for something to be intentional, because if there is no consciousness, then intentionality is moot at that point, right? So for me, if God is not a conscious being, then we shouldn't be talking about intentionality in this instance. If newer things in the world or new states of affairs can be produced unintentionally, but by merely relating with other things in the world, which for me is the necessary thing, then we cannot talk about intentionality. So it is not that I equate per se consciousness with intentionality. I don't want to even think about that. But it does seem to me that intentionality follows from consciousness, such that you need to be, there needs to be some sort of consciousness for intentionality to work. That is my current thought at this very moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, Maduka, please go ahead.
Can I make a comment on that, Assis? Because
sorry, she said it's a follow-up, I believe, right?
Sorry, everyone. Very, very quickly. I think the question is pertinent because the argument you give it really gets to the conclusion that God is not an agent because he doesn't create.
Yeah.
But it might allow the possibility that God is aware. So if you equate consciousness with awareness, he might be an entity which, despite not being an agent, is aware. And this is interesting because it's the view of Advaita Vedanta, which is a big tradition in India. They deny that God is the creator of the world. They don't use the word God, they use the word Brahma. But anyway, it's not an agent. But even though it's not an agent, it is aware. They define it as pure awareness. Just a comment.
Oh, cool.
Sorry for that.
I think that was pertinent.
If Professor Arabia, I'm sorry, if Maduka wants to ask his or her question, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, the moderator. And Professor Arabia, I want to thank you for those radical ideas you are pushing forward. I am worried about some of the submissions that you made concerning the notion of God. Some of those submissions run riot of the Christian idea of God. And the conception of God from the African perspective that you also were not comfortable with, that you seem to criticize, also are similar to the idea of God in the Christian perspective. So I have just two questions that I want to raise. I don't know how you're going to respond to it, considering your submissions. Number one submission that got me worried is that you said God is an unconscious being. And of course, a figment of human imagination, since we are not too sure whether he exists or not. And then following that, you also went ahead to submit that the idea of evil is a figment of one's imagination also, that nothing really is evil in itself. You see, so I don't know what will be your response in the context of the Christian scripture in Isaiah 45, verse 7 specifically. Just want to use that as an example to ask this question, where the Christian God was speaking of himself. And he says, and I quote from the scripture, Isaiah 45, verse 7, and he says, I am the Lord and the God. I create darkness and light, and I also create evil and good. I, the Lord, do these things. Verse 7 of Isaiah 45. So he's speaking as a self-conscious being. And here you said he's not conscious. And then he also refers to himself being the creator of evil and good. And here your conception is that there's no evil, does not exist, and evil, there's nothing that's really evil. So I don't know what will be your response in the context of that scripture I just quoted. Thank you, Arabia.
All right, thank you very much, Maduka, for your question. I think you're very interesting question, and I think it's an indictment of some Christian beliefs that seem to have this idea that God is omnipotent and all that, when God himself describes himself as the creator of good and evil. I think those are interesting ideas. So first off, like I said at the beginning of the talk, my concern is not with the Christian God. And I am not describing the Christian God. Even if we wanted to talk about the Christian God as you have just tried to express just now, we will have to take many assumptions, take many liberties, which I am not comfortable with. We have to assume that the verse that you read was actually written by God, or was a sort of reenactment of what God has said to someone or something like that. We would have to take that idea seriously, which at this point and for the purposes of this lecture, I don't think there is good reason to take it seriously, since it is difficult for one to show, at least empirically or even logically, that it is possible for God to speak to an individual in that way. All right. Even if we did take that liberty, the God that is being described there is a limited God, right? One that's limited in the sense that it is not at least omnibenevolent. And I think that is what's the word now? That reflects the Old Testament God, as far as I know. I think that the Old Testament God is not omnibenevolent, right? So that would fall under the limited God thesis. And then for that sort of God, the problem of evil would not exist. So finally, just to respond to the question you've asked, I wasn't trying to describe the African God. I was trying to describe a God that, as far as I know, follows logically, or is a logically plausible God, rather than one that we just make up attributes and grant to it, superlative attributes and grant to it. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we actually move, I have a follow-up on Maduka's question, because even if we take for granted, even if we don't take for granted the Christian position here, even talking from a African perspective, as we are doing here, you said that, I mean, and you are, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, you said that to take the Christian position for granted, you would have to make a lot of assumptions, like the nature of the communication between gods and humans through a scripture, for example, right? Now that lead me to ask, I mean, how is your perspective, or the African perspective, regarding the communication between these non-conscious entity like God, from the African perspective, and the humans? I mean, is there any kind of communication at all? Because, you know, especially in the Christian tradition, or not necessarily in the Christian tradition, but in the classic theism, we have like philosophers like Schoenberg, for example, who would say that it is expected that if God is a good entity, he's expected, so you're making a prediction, he's expected to not only intervene in the world, but also to communicate with the creatures that he created. So in that case, I mean, in your perspective, in the African perspective, is there any kind of communication between this entity and humans? Just to follow up on this question. Yeah.
All right, that's a good question. So for me personally, as a philosopher of religion and all that, I do not think God communicates and all that, because again, God is not a conscious or personalized entity. But in much of African philosophy of religion, right, there is the idea that God communicates, at least the supreme being, that is, communicates its desires to the lower deities, which then transmit this communication to certain individuals who are thought of as having special capacities to receive these messages. So you have diviners, for instance, or seers, or things like that. through which God communicates its will to these individuals, and then these individuals communicate to the society. So so that is how God communicates. It's not like the Christian tradition where there is this written literature that is supposed to encapsulate all what God has to say about the world. So it's different in that way. But yes, God does communicate in various ways. There is also the idea of destiny, that God gives people destinies, which they then try to fulfill, and sort of like that is God's purpose for them, and God communicates in that way to them, and so on and so forth. So yeah, in the African tradition, God does communicate with other things or its creations. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. So now, Arnold, you have a question, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have been very impressed by your conference and the strong demonstration. And my question is about liberty. In your conception, in the metaphysical background, have you a place for liberty, free will, possibility of choice? Bad choice, good choice, and the consequence for the evil problem.
All right, so that's a very interesting question. In my book, Groundwork for a New Kind of African Philosophy, I present a very predeterministic world. And I call it predeterministic because the way the world, I believe that the way the world is right now is dependent on the exact nature of the first cause. If the first cause was different in its nature, we would have a fairly different world. And I also think that because of the relationship that exists between things in the world, that relationship necessitates a new state of affairs, and that carries on almost infinitely, I think, in the future. So, but to answer your question specifically, no, there is no place for free will within the context of my metaphysics. I do not believe that there is free will. I think even when we define free will, we see its implausibility, because for me, free will would have to involve what I call a dislinked effect. A dislinked effect would be a thing's capacity to become a first cause in itself through its own. So if you say, I decided to present this talk without any past influences or anything determining my presenting this talk, what I'm just declaring is that I myself am a first cause, because I have the capacity to create new things that are not, linked to any predeterministic history. For me, I don't think human beings have that capacity in any way. All right? I don't think human beings have that capacity. So I think every human action or everything in the world, every state of affairs is determined. All right? And of course, that might have implications for ethics. My present view is that whereas we cannot plausibly hold anybody responsible for their actions, we are determined to blame them for their actions, because we live in the sort of world where doing certain things would elicit a certain reaction from certain other persons, which could be blame or praise, for instance. So whilst logically speaking, we cannot blame any individual for doing something wrong, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that doing something wrong cannot become a sort of cause for other persons to elicit the feeling of blame towards you, or feeling of anger towards you, and so on and so forth. So I do not believe that human beings have free will. I believe that everything in the world is determined, and human beings included.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have two questions in the chat. I guess I believe it's for the same person. Yes, for the same person. So Guidon asks, one of your resolutions of the problem of evil in the context of a theory of personal God you referenced in your talk is the idea that in the eyes of God, what humans call evil is not evil. Your rebuttal of this position is untenable because humans still experience those or horrendous evils. Thus, evil continues to exist in the world. However, you also go to argue that evil doesn't or is not an issue in your theory because it's a subjective category. This seems contradictory. Could you kindly clarify as to why there might not be a contradiction? So the person still wants to press on
So
even though you wanted to say that there is no evil, I mean, people still experience evil. And there is also a second question you wanted me to.
Can I respond to this one first?
Please, go ahead.
Before we go. All right. So thank you, Gideon, for your talk. Fortunately, there is no contradiction there. So the reason why there is no contradiction is that I was playing devil's advocate, for instance. I wasn't, so I was saying that this is one response to this particular critique of the omni-God thesis, which I do not subscribe to in any way. So it is not that that is my idea. I am putting myself in the place of the believers of the omni-God, whatever, and saying that, well, this is how they might respond to this problem. And this is why someone might take their response to be wrong, right? That has nothing to do with my view. So we are talking about two different things here.
Okay, fair enough.
So the second question, yeah.
So the second question is, how do you respond to the argument that there is the universe is finely tuned for nature of the that the nature of the universe suggests the existence of an intentional creator? So that's a bit different from your claims about the first cause of the universe, right? Because the first cause doesn't, as you said, doesn't necessarily need to be an intentional agent. But if in case of fine-tuning argument, so this suggests, according to the question, this suggests that there is an intentional creator. So is that like some claim that is that fits in your framework, in your worldview, please?
All right. I think is that still from Gideon?
Yes. That's
all right. Thank you, Gideon, for that question. Yes, that's usually the argument that most people make. How is it that the Earth is the third planet from the sun, placed in this habitable, whatever, and all that? But what about the billions and billions of other planets that are not placed in the favorable spot, necessary for certain forms of life to exist, right? Even in this world that we say is so finely tuned, how many individuals have died from illnesses, natural disasters, and so on and so forth, even man's inhumanity to man? There is nothing to suggest that we live in a finely tuned world. This is a very terrible and meaningless world. If I had my way, I would not even live in this world in the first place. So I do not think that we live in a finely tuned world. It is just that because we found ourselves here and we found it habitable, we now want to project this idea that this thing must have been meant for us. But it wasn't meant for us. Even this world that we are talking about, in a few years' time, the sun is going to expand and eat it up, vaporize this finely tuned planet that we are living in. So there's nothing to suggest that this is a finely tuned world that we are living in. This is a very meaningless and in very many instances, a very terrible world.
Good. Thank you. Fair enough. Gideon replied saying, I mean, thought-provoking response. That's our idea. Thank you. I don't see any more people asking questions, but before we finish, I mean, in the meantime, if you still have one final question, any of you have a final question, let me know either via chat or raise your hand. But in the meantime, let me ask you my own question. Quick one. You said that in your view, God is not an immaterial being, right? So if that's the case, then how that fits within the model that you said that God is the first cause of everything that exists? Because if everything that exists includes nature, I mean, includes material entities, So how can the material entity create all the material entities if he is one material entity?
All right. So one assumption that I see lurking underneath that question is the idea that for something to be a first cause, it has to be immaterial in some sense. That doesn't have to be the case. In terms of how other things emanate from this material first cause that I'm talking about, the answer to that question is relationality. So in my view, once things present themselves in the world as existing, they are necessarily in a relationship. If they are necessarily in a relationship, it is that relationship that creates new state of affairs. And I'll give you a simple example. In Nigeria, they say there are 200 million Nigerians, for instance. And I am a Nigerian. The only reason you can define Nigeria as being a land where there are 200 million persons is because I exist as a Nigerian. Else we would be defining Nigeria in another term. So by merely existing and relating with my Nigerian brethren, I've created a new state of affairs. That is very simple. It required no intention. Well, I mean, there were intentional acts that led to my being here, but just being here it creates a new state of affairs, and you don't need to have some sort of magical, thing to happen for things to create themselves or for new state of affairs to emerge. So the first cause has to be material, in my opinion, because if it is immaterial in the way that I have defined it, then it cannot affect the world in any way, and it cannot be the cause of the material things we see in the world. So even if there are immaterial beings in the world, which I do not agree that they are, those things have nothing to do with this universe or the universe we exist in. All right. So as far as this universe is concerned, as far as everything that exists is concerned, it has to have a material first cause, in my opinion.
Very good. Thank you very much. Very good. So maybe a final question from Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you, Arabia, for that thought-provoking talk, even though I had to run out and then come back in. My question really is to get a firm grasp of your idea of God, all right? As the trigger event, that was the expression you used in your book to describe the first cause. Would I be correct to say that a fine way of describing your trigger event, your first cause, your God, would be to say that it is like a mechanical apparatus, all right? It is materialistic, and it is a mechanical apparatus, just like a coffee machine. Okay, if that is correct, then why would you sort of, if I understand you clearly, deny, even subtly, the existence of evil, the reality of evil? Because this mechanical apparatus, like a coffee machine that combines water and coffee to give you a fine blend, it would also combines ingredients of good and evil, or all kinds of things in what you call singular complements, to give us the world that continues to be oiled by relationality. So even though you say that if a hurricane occurs in Jupiter, it's not evil because it hasn't killed anybody or harmed us in any way, suggesting, according to you, that evil is that which seems unpleasant to us. Is that not enough to explain the existence of the reality of evil? If something is unpleasant to us, we call it evil. We've got the poetic license to name our experiences. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jonathan, for your thought-provoking question. Jonathan is my metaphysical nemesis. You asked a very interesting question, and I think this has a lot to do with the critique you had of my ideas in your research paper about the harmony God and all that. So for me, it is precisely because evil is a category of the mind. That's why I don't think it's an objective reality. Even suffering, as Ricardo, earlier pointed out, he said something along the lines of, well, suffering is a better term. Everybody does feel suffering and all that. Yes, that's true. But the main point is that, yes, it exists as some sort of subjective qualia, if you want to call it that. But objectively speaking, I don't think it does. And so if you say, for instance, human beings go extinct and go out of existence, we say evil is still existing in the world. We wouldn't say that. Suppose everybody decided to be stoic, right? Or everybody decided to be ascetic and think of suffering as something joyful. Will suffering be something bad in that instance? No, we will not consider it bad. So what is important for me is this idea that suffering or evil is a category of the mind. If it is a category of the mind, the way the mind interprets certain activities, so for instance, if I move my hand like this, there is nothing wrong with that unless I move my hand like this and it hits someone, right? So when we interpret these, actions or activities we see or entities we see under certain lights, under certain categories and label them evil, it is not that those things are intrinsically evil. It is because we labeled them, we view them subjectively as evil. If that is the case, then I do not think that evil is an objective thing in the world. And if it is not an objective thing in the world, I do not believe that the problem of evil is necessary at that, given that realization. So for me, it is precisely because evil is a category of the mind. That is why I think the problem of evil does not exist.
Thank you very much, Professor Aribia and Jonathan. So I actually want to take the opportunity to thank all of you for showing up, for being here with us. That was a wonderful interaction. Thanks again, Professor Aribia, for your participation and for sharing your work with us. Before we finish, I want to pass the word to Genevieve Bizier. He has a quick announcement for us. Go ahead, Genevieve. So his mic is muted. Can you
have to unmute your mic, Genevieve.
It's still not working. Let's give some time to Genevieve so he can unmute himself.
It seems that he's on mute, but we can't hear him.
Yes. Maybe, Genevieve, can you be... Okay, let me see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Well, I just want to remember that we will have the 4th edition of our world event on logic and religion next September in Sinaia, Romagna. Very nice location. And it's at the beginning of September, and everybody is welcome to join us. Martin will put the link on the chat. Martin, can you hear me?
Yes, you already put the link.
Okay, he's put the link. And so the deadline is at the end of this month of May. And now maybe Ricardo will say a few words about the next speaker. Ricardo?
Oh yes, we are going to have Grand Priest. He's going to talk about ineffability and logic. Everyone is welcome. It will be, hold on, June 15th, in about 1 month.
Okay, thank you very much for all of you again for being here with us, and see you again in our next section next month. Thank you very much. See you all.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Mm.